George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, was a man of contrasts. While he's often remembered for his calm, introspective nature and deep spiritual beliefs, there was a darker side to his journey. A side marked by struggles with fame, isolation, and inner turmoil. Behind the image of the serene musician lay a man wrestling with the burdens of being one of the most famous people in the world, all while seeking peace in a world that never stopped watching him. Today, on Timelines Unlocked, we're taking a deep dive into George Harrison's dark side, the fame, the loneliness, and the personal battles he fought after the Beatles' breakup. Stick around as we uncover the life of a man whose search for inner peace was constantly at odds with the weight of global stardom. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, many thought George Harrison would finally get the recognition he deserved. For years, he had stood in the shadows of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, two of the most celebrated songwriters of the 20th century. Despite penning some of the Beatles' most iconic songs, like Here Comes the Sun, Something, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, George often felt overlooked. He had been limited to only a few songs per album while Lennon and McCartney dominated the creative direction of the band. The breakup of the Beatles should have been George's opportunity to step into the spotlight and fully express his artistic vision. And in many ways, he did just that with his first post-Beatles release, All Things Must Pass. The triple album was a massive success, both critically and commercially, with tracks like My Sweet Lord becoming instant classics. But despite the album's triumph, fame continued to take its toll on George, and what should have been a period of liberation quickly turned into one of his darkest struggles. All Things Must Pass was hailed as one of the greatest solo albums by any former Beatle. It allowed George to showcase the depth of his songwriting and his spiritual influences, particularly from Indian music and culture, which had fascinated him since the Beatles' time in India with the Maharishi. The album's success proved that George was more than just the third Beatle, he was a powerful force in his own right. But this newfound freedom came with a price. Fame, which had been an inescapable part of George's life since the early days of Beatlemania, now felt even more oppressive. Instead of feeling empowered by his success, George began to retreat from the public eye, seeking solace in the quiet and isolation of his private estate, Friar Park. Friar Park, a 120-room mansion set on 62 acres of land in Henley-on-Thames, became George's sanctuary. After years of living in the whirlwind of Beatlemania, it was here that George sought peace and privacy. But even in the vast, serene landscape of Friar Park, the pressures of fame followed him. Fans and reporters would camp outside the gates, hoping for a glimpse of the elusive Beatle. Inside, George found comfort in his garden, spending hours tending to plants and walking the grounds. But as peaceful as it seemed, isolation also had its downsides. The solitude that George craved often left him feeling cut off from the world, feeding into his darker thoughts. One of the central struggles of George's post-Beatles life was his ongoing battle with identity. He was a rock star, but he didn't want to be defined by that label. Unlike John Lennon, who thrived on the controversy and spectacle of fame, or Paul McCartney, who embraced his role as a pop icon, George sought something more. His interest in Eastern philosophy and spirituality, particularly the teachings of Hinduism and the Hare Krishna movement, played a significant role in his search for meaning beyond the material world. He wasn't just interested in being a famous musician, he wanted to transcend that world entirely. Yet, no matter how much he tried to distance himself from fame, it always seemed to pull him back in. This tension between George's spiritual aspirations and the realities of fame is evident in his music. In his 1973 album Living in the Material World, George wrestled with the contradictions of his life. On one hand, he was a wealthy, famous rock star. On the other, he was a man trying to live a life of spiritual devotion. Songs like Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, and the title track reflect his longing for something deeper, a sense of inner peace that seemed constantly out of reach. His fans adored him for his honesty and his willingness to speak openly about his spiritual journey, but for George, the dichotomy between his public and private selves was a source of great internal conflict. By 1974, George's struggles became increasingly apparent to the public. That year, he embarked on his infamous Dark Horse tour, a disastrous chapter in his career that only deepened his sense of isolation and frustration. His voice was damaged from overuse, and the grueling tour schedule took its toll. Critics savaged his performances, with some noting that George seemed disengaged and distant on stage. Even fans began to turn on him, disappointed by the lackluster shows and George's apparent indifference. The tour became symbolic of his broader struggle to balance the demands of fame with his desire for a more meaningful life. It was a stark reminder that no matter how much George tried to escape the trappings of his past, the shadow of the Beatles and the pressures of public expectation were always looming. After the failure of the Dark Horse tour, George withdrew even further from the spotlight. He continued to release albums throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, but his output was sporadic, and his interest in the music industry waned. He focused more on his personal life, particularly his marriage to Olivia Arias and the birth of their son, Donnie, in 1978. Fatherhood brought George a new sense of purpose and peace, but even in this domestic tranquility, the specter of fame continued to haunt him. The public still clamored for more music, more appearances, more of the George they had come to idolize during his years with the Beatles. But George was done with the spotlight. He wanted to live quietly, away from the adoration and scrutiny that had once consumed him. However, even in his self-imposed isolation, George couldn't entirely escape the dangers that came with fame. In 1999, a horrifying event occurred that would shake him to his core. A deranged fan broke into Friar Park and brutally attacked George, stabbing him multiple times. George survived the attack, but it left deep emotional and physical scars. The fact that even in the sanctity of his own home he wasn't safe from the consequences of fame was a bitter realization. The attack was a culmination of the dark side of his life as a Beatle. Fame, once a source of success and adoration, had now become something truly dangerous. Despite the traumas he endured, George never gave up his pursuit of spiritual fulfillment. His charitable work, including organizing the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, allowed him to channel his energy into helping others, and he remained devoted to his spiritual practices until the end of his life. However, even in his final years, George struggled with the balance between his spiritual life and the demands of the material world. His 1987 album Cloud 9 was a commercial success, reminding fans of his incredible talent, but it was clear that George's priorities had shifted. He no longer sought the approval of the public, he was focused on his own peace. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer, a battle he fought bravely for several years. Though he underwent treatment and briefly went into remission, the cancer returned, spreading to his lungs and brain. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away at the age of 58, surrounded by his family. His death marked the end of an extraordinary life, but it also cemented his legacy as a musician, spiritual seeker, and humanitarian. So, what can we learn from George Harrison's struggles? His life was a constant search for balance, between fame and privacy, success and spirituality, the material and the eternal. George's dark side wasn't about scandal or controversy. It was about the very real human struggles he faced as a man trying to find peace in a world that wouldn't leave him alone. He spent his life searching for something greater than fame, something more meaningful than wealth, but in the end, it was the very fame that defined him which made that search so difficult. What do you think? Was George Harrison able to find the peace he sought, or was fame a burden he could never fully escape? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into George Harrison's life, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Timelines Unlocked for more celebrity timelines just like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.